Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. I'll share my screen. Let's see. All right. Well, today is the first workshop of the year. My name is Megan Reed. I am the Director of Public Policy at Mental Health America of Greater Dallas. We have a few people coming into the waiting room, so excuse me if I get a little distracted. We have a very important and topic that we're going to be addressing today that isn't widely spoken about, but is something that we really need to take a look at and see how the historical content of what has impacted trauma within our communities and how that affects the individuals, families, and our general community as a whole. So I'm really excited to get started this morning. I do want to share a link before we get started. If you were with us last time, we did have a link tree. So I just want to post that in the chat. This just has several different links to resources that we've been talking about, and then also who our partner is today with the Diversity and Resiliency Institute of El Paso, with the Director of Diversity Institute, Resiliency Institute of El Paso, featuring Ashley Heidebrecht. So it has our information there, and then also some resources that we've been talking about. So before we get started, I do want to just go ahead and give you some general announcements with Mental Health America of Greater Dallas, just so you can be aware of a little other programs that we've been up to lately and things to look forward to in the coming months. So thanks first off to our sponsors for helping us off with the kickoff and then also supporting our workshops in the next few months. Without their help, there's no way that we'd be able to do this. So I want to thank Carrollton Springs, Hog Foundation for Mental Health, State Fair of Texas, CDF Texas, Blank Slate Therapy, and Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance. If you are wanting to have your organization partner with us or have an organization partner with us or fundraise or sponsor with us so that we can continue this programming going forward, then please let me know. I will definitely give my email address before the end of the session. So, let's see. It'll go forward. Okay, so some housekeeping. I just want to let everyone know that chat box feature is open. So please go ahead and introduce yourself. Let us know what organization you're coming from. If you want to network or give out your email address, go ahead and do that. We'd love to stay in contact with you. I know that we're seeing a lot of new faces here today. You're more than welcome to share your video, but I do ask that you mute yourself so that we can have the best presentation style as possible. For the best viewing, I do recommend doing well, we'll be sharing our screen, but to do a speaker view instead of a full meeting room view. Next, there will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Ashley's very good about stopping in the middle and making sure that there's no questions during the presentation. But please, if you do have some questions, I'll be monitoring the chat. Or if you are having technical issues, go ahead and message me. My name is Megan Reed, and let's see what we can do for you. This is being recorded, so if you have troubles or need to leave a little early, we can get you back on that playback. We'll be loading it up to YouTube later in the next few days. But go ahead and let me know if you have any questions or have any questions for the presenter. The last thing I do want to let you know is that we need to respect this space. We all come from different backgrounds, different histories and cultures. But today we're here to learn a little bit more on how racism impacts mental health and how it can be traumatic. So we want to ensure that this is a safe space, but to also respect others and to engage in a healthy and fruitful way. So if you have any questions, you can always directly message me. So just a couple announcements before we get started. We do have our first fundraiser of the year. It's a virtual workout. You don't have to go to a gym. You don't have to get any equipment. Just, All you have to do is sign up, log in, and do the workout at your own pace with the instructor. This is a no stress, this is self-care for you. Don't, you know, I hate working out, but I think that Sydney, our instructor for the training session, will be great. The only way to get a ticket is to donate to MHA Greater Dallas. There's no minimum or maximum, but please, as much as you can, to support, and you'll have a great session with Sydney and Link Cycling Studio. And we thank them for partnering with us on this. Next, I want to talk about our Adolescent Symposium. That's on February 11th. It is virtual this year. We're so excited. It's going to be a one in a lifetime event, one in an experience of an event where we have a one-day pass. And then also, if you want to take advantage of all our CEU opportunities, all the workshop opportunities, there is a 30-day pass. You get best for your buck with the 30-day pass, but there's networking, there's resources, there's vendors, you know, there's going to be Q&A with all the workshops. They're going to be live, and all these workshops are formatted in a very toolkit, you know, so that you can leave with resources and tools. So on that link tree, there is a link if you are interested in registering. Please do so as soon as possible so that you can get access to any of the you know, resources before the Adolescent Symposium and then also during. So before we get started, I do want to go over our commitment as we went over last time with our first presentation and our kickoff. First off, we are here to learn and to understand that racism and the impact on its mental health. There's a lot to talk about when we're talking about racism, whether it impacts criminal justice, education, civil rights. But today we're going to be talking about the impact on mental health. That's our goal, is to prevent and intervene in actions that may harm others or impede their wellness. So we're here today to learn a little bit about generational trauma and how that impacts mental health wellness into an adulthood and even for children. Secondly, we have our Diversity and Inclusion Task Force that has been set up for January 21st from 2:30 p.m. to 4 p.m. This is a second component for our Changing the Course of Mental Health program. This is the educational component. Then we'll also have a public policy component where we'll gather information, issues from the community, analyze them, and then also put some public policy and advocacy strategies so that we can change the impact of structural racism or institutional racism in our communities. But that only works if people come together from all sorts of different areas, expertise. So you don't have to be a mental health professional to be in this group. You can be in education, criminal justice, early childhood, healthcare, wherever your expertise lies. Please come to these meetings and help us build some effective public policy so that we can serve all in the community and be more effective in that way. And that leads into our action, what I was talking about with our Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. We'll go into an action strategy on how we can confront stakeholders like the city council members, the county commissioners, or even state legislators as far as what we can do to improve community issues. So that brings me to my end of my spiel. So thank you so much for listening. I am extremely excited to have all of you attend. I'm so thrilled to have Ashley with us today to talk about generational trauma. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ashley, the director of the Diversity and Resiliency Institute of El Paso.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being on today. I am so excited to be here with you. I want to say a couple of things. I am having about the worst problem a presenter in this time of COVID can have, which is a challenging internet connection this morning. So I am connected through my phone. as well as my computer. So if at some point my computer Wi-Fi disconnects, I will still be connected through my phone. Megan has a copy of my presentation, so if need be, we can team up and go about it another way. So I just want to let you all know that in advance, I am having some connectivity problems. I also do live in an apartment, which comes with its own challenges working from home during the time of COVID. So just be advised that hopefully it won't happen, but you may hear background noise at some point from people outside or neighbors, etc. So just to let you all know that is a possibility, but I will do my best to minimize any distractions on my end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, it looks like Megan, my screen sharing is disabled. There we go. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as Megan said, my name is Ashley Heidebrecht. I'm the director of the Diversity and Resiliency Institute of El Paso. And today I'm going to be talking with you about the generational impact of racism. So just a tiny bit about me. I've been in the field of mental health social services for around 13, 14 years now. I've had a pretty diverse career. I've worked in a lot of different areas, mental health, direct care. I've worked with the homeless population, but for the last 5 or so years, my main focus has been advocacy and activism, specifically focused around the LGBTQ plus community, racial equity, and migrant rights. So I'm very happy to be with all of you today to talk about this topic. So our goals for today are to gain knowledge and insight regarding the history and nature of racism, explaining the relationship between narratives, bias, exploitation, and generational trauma, and identifying ways in which bias and generational trauma from racism impact mental health and mental health care. So the Diversity and Resiliency Institute of El Paso is an education program that is part of the Borderland Rainbow Center. Borderland Rainbow Center is an El Paso nonprofit that is a queer-run and largely queer-serving organization in the Borderland. And so we provide LGBTQ plus affirming individual, group therapy, support groups, addiction recovery, peer support. We have a food pantry that's open to the entire El Paso area, and we provide community and professional education. And our education program is fairly new, though we've been providing trainings for the last 4 years or so, but it's more formal now, and we've really opened up to other topics outside of LGBTQ plus inclusion and cultural competency. And our goal is to create inclusive and affirming spaces and mindsets. I think that's the key word, mindsets, right? That takes a lot more work. And to promote values of equity, social justice, and to unpack really difficult concepts and encourage cultural humility. So that's just a little bit about us. And I know Megan has linked our education program and the resources. So thank you very much for that. So we're going to get started. There's a lot to talk about in this presentation today, and I'm going to do my best to not go off on any tangents, though as anyone who engages with these topics knows, it's very easy to do because it's so complex, so in-depth, and there's many different roads and thought processes that we could take. So we have a lot to cover. But first, a disclaimer. As you can see, I am a white person. I am a white person. And so what that means is I will not be sharing stories of lived experiences of marginalized groups. I will not be talking about how anyone from a marginalized group feels. I will not be speaking on behalf of any individual or group that I do not belong to, right? That's a very important point to make. when engaging in any type of professional training with these topics, understanding our own person, our own identity, and the limitations that can come with that, and also the privilege that comes with that. What I will be doing is I will be sharing historical context, providing information to demonstrate the clear relationship between history and present day, and discussing the impact of racism on mental health and accessing mental health care. And I will be asking you to reflect, think deeply, and explore your own beliefs, bias, and how they impact your practice and your work with the community. Okay? So history, it's not just in the past, right? We all have our own personal histories. We have our personal experiences, our things that we bring with us from childhood that become part of who we are, our own traumas, our own lived experiences, right? So we know that just because something happens in the past doesn't mean that it only lives in the past. It carries forward with us. So the relationship between the past and the present is crucial in understanding why we are where we are today. So the first important point about history concerning race is that race is a social construct. It is something that was created by white people, by Anglo-Europeans, for the benefit of white people. So the concept of race itself was created by Anglo-Europeans as a means of maintaining social and economic power. So when Western Europeans first migrated to what we now call the United States, of course, there had been imperialism and colonialism in other parts of the world already by that point, but we're talking US specific here today. So as they migrated over to what we now call the United States, there was, of course, already people living here, right? And so there was already a mission to kind of establish dominance. And as more people began to migrate from other parts of the world, from Eastern Europe, from other areas where skin color began to look differently, there was more immigrants, more people of different cultures. There began to feel the pressure of, we're losing our power, we're losing our status as the majority. And so let's create a concept that will allow us to continue to have that power. And so race itself was created for the purposes of maintaining that power. And racism is discrimination or prejudice against people of other races based on belief that their own race is superior. Power dynamics are a big part of racism. We often hear terms like reverse racism, right? But even in that term, there is still the acknowledgement of the power differential. Even for someone to say reverse racism, they're still acknowledging the fact that there is a power differential for racism to occur in the first place. And so for it to flip on its head, there has to be some sort of shift in that power structure. Racism and white supremacy are in our foundation. So I talked briefly just a moment ago about race being a social construct, the idea of whiteness being a social construct. And so for, excuse me, in order for that consolidation of power, that dominance of power to continue both economically and socially, there had to be some rules put in place, right? When we think about the foundations of the United States, our founding documents, for example, we know that within our Constitution, that wording was not inclusive, right? That's not a secret. Everyone knows that. We know that within our Constitution, not everyone was considered to be a full and complete human being, and that was tied directly to skin color and to race. And so for it to be that deep foundationally, and for all of our institutions and structures to be built on top of that, that creates a system that is so deep, so complex, but that also in many ways feels normal and just the way that it has always been. there's more than one type of racism. And racism, all racism is rooted in the ideology of white supremacy. So when we talked about race being created as a social construct, we're going to get into that deeper here with the concept of white supremacy. So I want to point out this illustration here to the right. So pretty offensive illustration if we're being honest, but this is something that was utilized along with the junk science of craniometry, which was the study of face shape, head shape, and size, and the linkage of that to more animalistic and less intelligent traits. And so we can see in this image, we have a person of African descent, we have an Anglo in the center, and then we have an Irish person to the left. And so one thing that's important to point out with this image and with the concept of race and white supremacy and that creation of consolidation of power and majority status is the allowance of previously discriminated European groups into that category of white simply for the purpose of establishing dominance and a majority. So early on, the Irish were discriminated, Catholics were discriminated against as well. Of course, not at all to the same level as those who were brought enslaved from Africa. But in order to maintain that power, there was that absorption of these other European people who were, quote, white enough. They were white enough to pass the test. They were white enough to become part of that majority in order to keep those who were not of European descent oppressed. So white supremacy is that belief that white people are superior to all other races and should therefore dominate society. And white supremacy is a complicated thing because throughout history, we see, colonialism and imperialism around the world. And so we see white Anglo people asserting dominance around the world. And what ends up happening is that then creates a narrative, which we're going to talk about narratives more in depth later, but that creates a narrative that reinforces the idea that white people are inherently more dominant, more capable, more, quote, civilized, more intelligent. And it feeds into that narrative because it becomes the belief that, well, if white people weren't superior, weren't better, how could they overtake so many other nations? So for people who believe in that ideology of white supremacy as truth, it becomes a cyclical thing where that narrative reinforces the belief. And everything else that has allowed those historical moments of overtaking other people are overlooked. The violence is overlooked, the land theft, the theft of natural resources, all in pursuit of maintaining that white dominance and asserting that white people are superior. So white supremacy is an ideology of entitlement. Historically, white people of Anglo descent have felt entitled to space, entitled to land, entitled to resources, and it all cycles back to that ideology of white supremacy. And from that comes the practice of racism and racial discrimination and exploitation and violence. So white supremacy is the framework upon which U.S. systems and institutions are built. And not just U.S. alone, but again, as I said, we're talking more specifically about the U.S. today. So it's built on that framework of white dominance, of Anglo dominance. And as I said, it is the basis of the practice of racism. So this ideology is woven into the fabric of who we are. It's like if we think about a home or a building, what the foundation is made of and how strong the foundation is important, right? And so what happens when we have white supremacy and racism in our foundation and the whole house is built on top of that? That means that the house was built for white people. The house wasn't built for anyone else. And so for it to be accommodating or appropriate or safe for anyone else, what happens is then it begins to feel unsafe for the people that it was built for. And so that's when we start to see resistance to anti-racism, resistance to change, resistance to racial equity. So I like to use the analogy of a house because I feel like it's pretty clear and kind of gives that visualization. And so if we're going to change our house, right? If we're going to rebuild our house, we can't build it on the same foundation, right? There has to be substantial structural change, and that's going to feel uncomfortable. So racism, right, there's different types. It's not just person-to-person interaction. For the longest time, right, there was kind of this belief that racism was just this interpersonal thing, and that you know, if you're nice to people, if you treat people with respect, don't do anything to directly harm someone, then you're kind of in the clear. But there's different levels upon which racism exists. There's systemic, right, which is ongoing racial inequalities maintained by society. Institutional racism, which is policies, practices within organizations and institutions. And I'm talking all institutions, right? Our education system, legal system, medical care, mental health care, government, banks, housing, all of those things are institutions. And they're all built upon that same foundation. And we have interpersonal racism, which of course is that interpersonal one-on-one or small group interaction where we see bigotry and biases are shown between individuals through words and actions. And then we have internalized racism, which is race-based beliefs and feelings within individuals. We often hear the term internalized racism focusing on people of color internalizing racism within themselves, and that impacting self-esteem, you know, health and well-being, all of those things. But it also applies to white people with the beliefs that are held deeply within and not necessarily expressed outwardly, but still impact how we view the world, how we see the world. So what exactly are institutional and systemic racism? It's patterns of social institutions and systems giving negative treatment to a group of people based on race, having a disproportionately negative effect on racial minorities' access to and quality of goods, services, and opportunities. So it's racial discrimination that has become established as normal behavior within a society or organization, right? And importantly, it changes over time. Structural, systemic, institutional racism does not look the same as it did in the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s. It looks differently. Perfect example, right? Jim Crow laws don't technically exist anymore, but the impact of those laws still exists, right? And things like mass incarceration still exists. So as racism, as society changes, as it becomes less acceptable to demonstrate overt and violent racism. Now notice I didn't say unacceptable, I said less acceptable. As it becomes less acceptable to demonstrate those things, racism in our institutions and systems starts to look different. So what does racism really look like? Well, it looks like regular attempts at genocide. And I'm using that language, that strong language, for a very specific reason, because that's the truth of it. When we look at things that have taken place historically, and even things that continue to take place today, that is the objective. The objective is to eliminate what does not fit into this house that was built for our nation. So we have, right, land theft and the concept of manifest destiny, right? That, you know, that white supremacy defined idea that white people have the right to come take what they want. And so what does that do? To steal land, to steal culture, to attempt to erase culture, thinking about our First Nations, Native American, Indigenous folks. What is that? Well, it's attempting to get rid of an entire group of people, to wash them out, to make them disappear. That way you can have more space, more things. Slavery, right? An attempt to wipe out an entire culture of people by exploiting them for their labor. And we see that other places as well. We see labor exploitation and migrant workers. We saw labor exploitation with Chinese immigrants and building the railroad. Jim Crow laws, right? Those were designed to keep Black people, Mexican people, anyone who was not white from experiencing the full benefits of living in a quote free society, right? To prevent them from being able to thrive and to erase them from the visual field of white people in their space, right? If we have segregation, if we don't allow people who aren't white in certain spaces, that means white people don't have to look at them, don't have to interface, effectively erasing them. Immigration laws, right? Those have changed, ebbed and flowed throughout our history, targeting different groups at different times, depending on who, depending on our politics, depending on leadership, all of those things. We've recently had, within the last 4 years, we've had a Muslim ban. We've had lots of incredibly harmful, abusive immigration policy towards Central Americans and Mexican migrants. We've seen, deep within our history, right, the Chinese Exclusion Act, all of those different things have taken shape throughout different generations to effectively exclude people that were deemed less valuable, less human, less beneficial for our society. Redlining and housing issues, right? Those are, brought about by the Jim Crow era, but the legacy of that still lives on. Along with that, right, we have discriminatory lending and banking processes, educational disparities, lack of education, denial of education, generational poverty, mass incarceration. I can read and go through this entire list and give tons of examples, but the point is that all of these things amount to the continuous attempt to erase entire groups of people, right? Continuous attempts to erase entire groups of people, or to find loopholes where we can say, well, they're good for this, they're good for their labor, they're good for our entertainment, they're good for whatever it may be, but then it stops there. It stops there. It stops just short of the true freedom and ability to thrive and have access to the abundance of opportunity that is possible. Let's talk mental health specifically. And I want to spend some time on this because as people who are providing mental health care, providing, working in social services, social work, whatever it may be, we must acknowledge our problematic history, right? Every institution, we are an institution. Me as a social worker, I have to understand the baggage that comes with my profession and some of the horrible things that were done. So it's important that we understand these things and take ownership as we've chosen this career. So by the end of the 19th century, many psychologists believed and operated on the belief that the African race had smaller brains, and the African race had a more natural instinct for labor and were psychologically adolescent compared to Anglos. So this was a belief adopted by many in the psychology profession. So what does that mean? Well, that means that then practices are built upon those beliefs, right? When we have knowledge, quote knowledge, right, that we believe to be truth, we believe to be rooted in science and experience and all of those things, then we build upon that, right? We see that with evidence-based practices that we use today. Those came from someone's idea and brain and have been tested and found appropriate over time. So the same for this. This was found appropriate for a period of time. And so that means that foundationally, a lot of things were built upon these beliefs. And this leads to that belief then that the darker the skin, the less intelligent, the less capacity for civilized behavior a person has. We begin to see assignment of animalistic type traits and behavior and expectations. So in 1851, a notable thing is that a Louisiana surgeon and psychologist published a report on what he deemed to be common diseases among Black people in the South. One being drapetomania, which was the disease causing slaves to run away. So let's think about that, right? This was, ending towards the ending of Civil War, Jim Crow laws are on the horizon. So we have now a psychological disorder labeled that says this is why they're psychologically disturbed. They don't understand that their natural place in this world is to provide labor for white people. So just kind of stew in that, right? There is that belief that this was the natural order of things. And so for people, we know right now, even in modern day mental health practice, when people deviate from the norm, it is considered disordered. And so this deviating from what was determined to be the normative state of existence was considered deviating from the norm, was considered deviant behavior. So the abolitionists and civil rights movements brought labels of psychological and social dysfunction to African Americans. The label of schizophrenic, right, due to their supposed pathological reaction to emotional disharmony, hostility, and aggression. And interestingly, we still see a disproportionate diagnosis of schizophrenia in Black men today. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all Black men diagnosed with schizophrenia, that it's because the psychologist or diagnosing professional is racist. I'm not getting at that point, but what I am saying, I'm asking you to just kind of contemplate the relationship between these two things. And to think about, the idea that even now, hundreds of years later, racism and this history of it being believed that a Black person wanting different than the place they were placed in, forced to be in, is disordered thinking. So just kind of stew with that a little bit. So think about normative categories, right? Who was/is viewed as abnormal. For health and mental health is viewed in terms of function and dysfunction. And what those terms mean are very much determined by what is considered normal and acceptable by society, right? We have to have labels, categories, etc., for us to develop common language, especially within a health or mental health profession, right? Common language is necessary in order for us to be able to research, to create appropriate methodology, etc. So a question to ask yourself, though, is who determined normal? What is the definition of normal based on? And is the definition at all designed to benefit a specific group? So thinking about that, reflecting back on the knowledge that racism, white supremacy are foundational in our institutions. That the idea that the natural order of things is white people on top of the hierarchy. So where did these concepts of normal and abnormal come from? And who do they benefit? Right? Now, again, please know, I'm not saying that the profession of psychology is a wash or anything like that, because clearly I've worked in the field for a long time. I don't believe that, but it's important that we reflect on these broader overarching themes and concepts that do in some way inform the profession and definitely did impact historically the way clients and the communities were treated. So today, as far as mental health goes, normal functioning is backed by science, right? We have evidence-based practices, all of those things. But are there any other elements informing the definition of normal? So how about social work, social services, as far as issues there? You know, the belief that white Christian families are superior, more capable, safer, more stable. When we look at things that have happened historically, like, for example, forced family separation and adoption from First Nations Indigenous families, right? That's a practice that continued up through 50s, 60s. And honestly, still continues today. The belief that, you know, these Native Indigenous children were better off being taken from their culture and placed into these better quality, better suited white Christian homes. Right? We had things like the Indian schools where children were taken and placed in these institutions to essentially learn whiteness, learn Anglo culture, and have their own culture be erased. And social workers played a role in that. Right? Social workers played a role in that. The same can be said for other racial groups. When we look at, you know, historically, those compounded effects of historical racism, like poverty, housing disparity, food insecurity, all of those things, creating home environments that are less safe and offer less opportunity to thrive. And so what then would happen is social workers would go into those homes of racial minorities, remove children, place them with white families, all the while ignoring, right, the root cause of why is this family in this situation? What's the broader context here? You know, and it was and continues to be in many cases our historical roots of racism and white supremacy, creating conditions that then don't allow people to thrive. So instead of addressing those more challenging conditions, the solution was to take the child and put them in a more, quote, in a better environment. So systemic racism and reinforced that belief. Sorry, I have a typo there. Systemic racism reinforced that belief, right? It's that cycle, that narrative cycle that we're going to unpack a little bit more in a moment. So reflect for a moment on ways this belief still impacts services today, right? Just think about that. How does this belief and these kind of side effects of systemic racism creating conditions, living conditions, and inability to thrive in some cases, how do those things still impact services today? So a few specific events, right? Everyone on this event today knows about slavery. We know that that existed. It still exists today in different forms, right? There's that with systemic and institutional racism, it changes shape over time, but still exists. So in slavery, we have instead mass incarceration. We have other forms. We have the residual effects of Jim Crow laws. But a few specific events that I wanted to make sure people are aware of is this period between 1917 and 1923. So this is height of Jim Crow era. And we had, the United States had several communities that were, you know, truly thriving places for Black Americans. There was economic stability. There was a lot happening in these communities listed here, right? Springfield, Missouri, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Elaine, Arkansas, District of Columbia, and Rosewood, Florida. And so what happens is these communities are beginning to thrive. Black people are experiencing success, and racial minorities in general in these areas. And what happens is then white people in the area, law enforcement, government agencies come in and violently destroy these communities. Thousands of people are killed, lynched, communities are just destroyed, burned down, bombed. And so what does that do? When you have seen, if you start to build, if you start to be stable, if you start to thrive, we're going to come take it from you. We're not going to let you have it. Think about what that does and how that compounds over time. And again, maybe we don't see things that we would consider that violent or extreme happening now, but these types of things still happen. It just looks differently. And so those things, again, as I've said before, they compound over time. I talked briefly already about the Indian schools, forced adoption, and family separation. We saw family separation over the last few years with migrants at the border. That's a place where I spent a lot of time and did a lot of work and have a lot of secondary trauma, secondhand trauma from that. I will never forget those experiences. But those things, those ideas of dehumanizing a group enough to where you feel entitled to physically, forcibly separate families from each other. Just reflect on what that takes, what kind of mindset that takes to enforce something like that. Medical exploitation and forced sterilization. This is something that doesn't get talked about enough. For periods of time all throughout period of slavery, Black people were experimented on, Black women specifically. And after slavery, those practices still continued. In the 50s and 60s, we still had experimentation going on. We had forced sterilization of Puerto Rican women, Black women, Hispanic women, Indigenous women, well up into the 70s. And in the 70s, I believe there was still that practice happening on Indian reservations in the United States. Those are real things that happen in some of your lifetimes, right? It's not just history. And those things very much still live today and very much still impact people that are walking this earth. And then, of course, we have things that maybe are better known, like the Tuskegee experiment involving syphilis. There have just been countless things. And so, I could list all of these and talk in depth, but I feel like those are things that you all have the capability of researching and learning more about, but I want them to be on your radar. Immigration policies, right? We've talked about some of these already. Exploitation of Mexican migrants. Again, a perfect example of people only having value when their labor can be exploited. ICE raids. That's something that, is a newer manifestation of family separation as well. It's the idea that, there is this inherent right to break up families. And the use of law enforcement in general to uphold white supremacy regularly. The one thing that I'm not going in depth on in this presentation is the racist history of law enforcement, because that's a whole thing all in and of itself. But when we think about how law enforcement has been used over time, when we think about early law enforcement with slave patrols in the South, used to wrangle Black people back into slavery. As I mentioned before, with these places, Springfield, Tulsa, Atlanta, Rosewood, DC, law enforcement again played a role in that destruction. And of course, we still see police brutality happening regularly. And we see law enforcement used on the border in family separation as well. So there's a constant relationship there. So when I mentioned earlier, right, about the what racism looks like, what the impact is, and that it's constant attempts at genocide. So what is the goal with each of these if it's not extermination? Why else would groups of people continue to be attacked, exploited, harmed, abused, if the goal isn't to remove them from society, to make it a space that feels good and powerful and in control for white people? So at this point, I would like to just pause. I'm gonna check my time here and see if anyone has any questions or comments. Understanding that we still have quite a bit more to go, but so far we've unpacked quite a lot of things. So I just want to check in and see if anyone has questions at this point. Like, see if I can open the chat here.
Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. I haven't seen any come through that were direct questions. Also, I want to let everyone know if you are, experiencing any high stress or anxiety or, very sensitive emotions to this information, that is extremely normal. And I want to open up, if you need any help or guidance, please message me directly and let's see if we can get you someone to talk to. But I just want to let everyone know that this is a safe space. So if you are feeling those feelings, that's okay. Take a moment to, breathe, take some good deep breaths and really digest this information. But thank you, Ashley, so far. The presentation's been great.
I do see a couple of points here, not necessarily in questions, but a person commented in the 60s and 70s, if a Black woman needed social services for her children, she could not have their father living in the home, thus the breakdown of the Black family. Mass incarceration equals slavery. Yeah, I think that those are super interesting points. And again, just for the sake of time, right, like we don't have time to unpack every single aspect of how messed up all of this really is, but 100% on that, right, like as I said, this society was not designed for any other group to thrive, and so everything is in place in order to make that more difficult. I also think I started to see a comment about not everyone is indoctrinated in this way. I would just, I guess, encourage anyone who is maybe feeling like these things don't impact them or don't impact the way that they think or interact with the community or clients. I would just ask you to reflect on that and to understand that regardless of who you are, we're all impacted by our shared history. We're all impacted by these things. And as we're going to explore now, we're going to talk about, bias and the power of that narrative. So I'm going to go ahead and keep moving because I know that we're running low on time and I want to make sure that I try to get everything in. Okay. So let's start connecting some dots. So how does racism persist after all this time? Well, we have narratives. And narratives are powerful. If anyone has ever done any work with narrative theory, right, and working with clients, that narratives have power. They're our story, and our story shapes how we view the world, our perception, how we interact. So we have some important narratives. We have white America is the true America. And we've seen this clearly throughout history, right? We have our lovely illustration of Uncle Sam kicking a Chinese person out of the country during the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? We have this idea now as we see it with Central American and Mexican migrants being viewed as a threat, having very specific language used to describe them, invaders, infestation, all of those things create this narrative of fear, which allows it to be easier for people to swallow when those people are mistreated. And all of that fear is surrounded by that ideology of white supremacy and white entitlement. White entitlement to space, to resources, that view of, well, if we let them in, then we won't have enough, right? Very common narrative. We also have seen this manifest as well with COVID. When COVID first started to flare in the US, we saw a spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans. This assumption of immigrant status, right? This assumption that if you don't look white, then clearly you're not from here and you don't belong here, and that makes you a threat. So we have, of course, the anti-immigrant narratives, which I feel like I've touched on pretty extensively at this point. But another important narrative is that whiteness is inherently good. Whiteness is inherently good. And the flip side of that is that anyone who is not white, and the darker your skin is, the more criminal you are, the more dangerous you are, the more of a threat you are. And we see this manifesting still in our media and the portrayal of different people when a crime has been committed, right? We see, a white man, a white college student is, oh, he was a star athlete, does such and such, or star athlete facing time, right? It's presented in that manner. And then we have someone like, Trayvon Martin, shot and killed, who is painted in a very different light. Or any of the other myriad of young people and Black people, people of color who have been assaulted or harmed, even in the last decade, are always portrayed differently. And then white people are more intelligent and more morally pure. And I want to point out again that reflecting way back into our history, as I briefly touched on law enforcement and that dynamic, again, think about drapetomania, the psychological diagnosis of a Black person wanting to escape slavery, escape their natural condition, right? So someone wanting freedom is disordered if they're not white. Someone who is seeking their freedom is considered a criminal. So from early stages, we've had this narrative that people of color, people who are not white, and Black people more specifically, are criminal, inherently more criminal. And so then we have propaganda that comes with that, propaganda with words, propaganda with images, this idea of sophisticated versus savage, an old concept that has been used and changed shape through generations. We have caricature depicting people as animalistic. We see this with Jewish people as well. We saw this with Japanese people during World War II, with any type of person of Asian descent throughout history, and of course with Black people and with people who are indigenous, Hispanic, Latinx, Mexican, any label that a person identifies himself with, right? The propaganda of white dominance being the natural order. And of course, dehumanization, right? That partners with that animalistic caricature, but also language that has been used to describe groups of people. So bias. Bias is the often unconscious preference for one thing over another. It's typically not fair, typically not necessarily rooted in any real fact or personal experience, though sometimes it is. You know, I as a woman, I may hold bias toward men when I'm out on a walking trail by myself. If I see a man approaching me because of my own personal experience, I may feel averse to that situation where I am alone in a situation without any kind of recourse for my own safety, right? So there is such a thing as like experiential bias, right? But we're talking more specifically about unconscious bias. And it's formed through narratives, right? It's formed through narratives we take in from authorities, that means parents, teachers, etc., media, established stereotypes, social norms, and more. So this means that bias is centered around what is considered normal or acceptable. So if something is considered normal or acceptable, you're more likely to feel comfortable, to be accepting, etc. But if something deviates from that norm, it's more likely to make you uncomfortable and possibly even cause you fear. So let's take a quick look at what's considered normal. I'm not going to go into super detail about these things, but I just want you to kind of observe this as I'm talking. So this is a really great tool to observe the intersection of domination and oppression and to discuss privilege. We're not going to go deep into privilege just for the sake of time, but of course that word always needs to be on the list when we're talking about racism. So I want you to look at this this image here. We have our domination line dividing this circle in half, and on top we have categories that have privilege in one way or another, and experience dominant status in our society, and these categories are also considered the norm. So underneath our dominance line are considered what we would consider oppressed categories. These are categories that aren't considered the norm. So looking at this, think about what I talked about before regarding our house and our foundation. Who was the house built for? We know it wasn't built for disabled people because accommodations had to be made. Disabled people weren't considered in the construction of buildings, resources, etc. Right? Deaf people weren't considered in the development of communication access. They had to be, penciled in and accommodated later. Right? Women weren't considered in developing social institutions and rights. Right? The right to vote had to be, fought for. The right to have a credit card in your own name had to be fought for. The right to own property had to be fought for. With racial minorities, with Black people, Indigenous folks, Asian people, anyone who was not in that category of white, as I said before, this house was not built for them. This bottom group on our circle here, if you think about it, their rights had to be penciled in, right? They had to be written into the Constitution as amendments. They had to be accommodated for after the fact. And so because of those things, those groups feel like an inconvenience to anyone who is in those dominant groups on top. And if you happen to be a person who only exists in these dominant groups, you carry a lot of privilege, right? But for the most part, most of us exist cross-sectionally in both of these spaces in one way or another. But I just want you to kind of reflect on this and think about it with our social dynamics and how we relate to and see each other. And understanding that for folks who are labeled as these categories that are in the oppressed section of this circle here, this wasn't built for them. It wasn't built with them in mind. It wasn't built with the idea for them to thrive. It had to be written in and accommodated for after the fact. And think about what that must feel like. If you don't belong to any of these groups, just think about what that must feel like to know that this world, that this place you live was not made for you. And there are many ways as you move through your life every day that you are reminded of that. So bias impacts our perception, how we see people and perceive reality, how we react towards certain people, our behaviors, how receptive, how friendly we are towards certain people, our attention, which aspects of a person we pay the most attention to, our listening skills, our language, and how much or how little we comfort certain people. And it also impacts who we believe is intelligent, who we believe is deserving and undeserving, and concepts like guilt versus innocence. So when we think about these narratives, which unfortunately we just aren't able to unpack all of them and the gravity of them, these narratives that started deep in our history, right, from our foundations, and they have been carried through, and we just often don't know that they are there and don't know that they are informing our perception and our view of the world. So as providers, we really need to be reflecting on this deeply and understanding that even if you've never used a racial slur, told a racist joke, done anything to directly harm anyone, you are part of this system. We all are. And so because of that, that means we have responsibility to address ourselves and to really reflect and make sure that we are doing our part to undo the harmful narratives that we have been fed. So this brings me to an important concept of this feedback loop, right? Racism and barriers, these structural things themselves are reinforced by narratives from people in power. Those narratives come down to us and form our perception, our bias and beliefs. And then we, as active members of these institutions, cycle back up our perception, bias, and beliefs right back into those same systems. So it becomes an ever-present feedback loop. And this feedback loop creates persistent cycle of systemic and interpersonal racism, creating a persistent cycle of trauma. And the impact of historical incidents trickle down into present day, compounding with new trauma. Okay? So as we continue moving forward, think about this feedback loop and where you are in it, where you fit. So we have these products of racism, right? Poverty, crime, substance abuse, food insecurity, housing insecurity, incarcerated parents, school to prison pipeline, chronic health conditions, behavioral issues, lack of education, and underlying all of that is lack of opportunity. And all of those things come together, creating additional trauma and stigma. Okay, but then what happens is it reinforces the narratives and bias, allowing the feedback loop to continue, because when people see communities of color experiencing these things, and there's that narrative that exists that inherently people of color are more criminal, inherently people of color are less morally sound, are less capable, it just cycles right back into there, because then your eyes see it, and so to you it's confirmation that that bias and belief is correct, instead of unpacking why this situation is existing. So of course, generational trauma, right, is that transmission of trauma across generations. First noted in 1966 by clinicians who were alarmed by the number of children of people who had survived the Nazi Holocaust who were seeking mental health treatment. What's interesting is, let's reflect here, the level of impact decades later on those who were not directly involved is what was considered the initial traumatizing event. right? So that means you don't have to have been a slave to be traumatized by slavery, right? You don't have to have been taken away from your parents as an Indigenous person to be traumatized by that. It's part of your collective community experience, as part of your collective community narrative and reality, okay? And the fact that this wasn't acknowledged, generational trauma wasn't acknowledged regarding Black communities post-slavery, nor regarding Indigenous peoples. So there's some things to unpack there too. And of course, our view of what trauma is has changed dramatically over time, right? We now understand trauma is not just from being a soldier at war, right? Trauma is complex. We all experience trauma in some way. Especially, I think most of us in 2020 probably experienced quite a lot of new things that we never thought we would. But, you know, the key thing is, right, you don't have to have been a direct victim, recipient of the abuse to be impacted by that generational trauma. So most of you have probably seen this or something similar. This is a depiction of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. And this displays the relationship between an individual, the systems that exist around them, and the impact that systems have on an individual. And what I want to point out to you here specifically is the chronos system, which is time. So when we're thinking about generational trauma, the chronos system becomes very important. These are historical events that have a comprehensive effect on the other systems, right? So when we talked about how systemic and institutional racism changes shape over time, that's our chronos system, right? The impacts of slavery, the psychological trauma of slavery, and everything that came after that, the psychological trauma of land theft and genocide of Indigenous people, right? There's residual effects from that. If land theft had never taken place, our country would look very different than it does now, right? So that's evidence that it had an impact, and that impact carries through today. You know, people wouldn't be on reservations. So there's that impact that compounds over time and trickles down to impact all of these systems, eventually getting to the individual. Okay? And so then when we think about that feedback loop, right, then the individual, their experience, their perception, the beliefs that they hold cycle back up into the systems around them. Right, but this image is specifically important because it demonstrates that chronological aspect of things that happen throughout our history. And so imagine, you know, having that historical trauma, right, of knowing that there's a strong chance that your lineage comes from slavery, of knowing that, you know, land was taken from your ancestors, of knowing any of these things that have happened throughout our history. Then all of the things that still occur today that are manifestations of racism compound on top of that historical trauma that's carried through communities. Okay. So I am actually not going to pause right here. I want to keep going because I want to just try to maybe have a little bit of time at the end. Megan, I hope that that's okay because I know we're running short on time. Okay.
That's good.
All right, so impact, right, on mental health and mental health care. Everyday racial trauma, evident through generations, right? We've talked about historical aspects, but these are all things that happen daily, that are traumatic. Now, notice some of these are not experienced by the person directly. Some of these are observations, right? Observing a person actively avoid being near you. That reminder that you're abnormal, you're a threat, you're scary, you don't belong, right? Some of these would be considered like microaggressions, right? Y'all, I'm sure heard that term by now if you hadn't in the past. watching, reading about another person of color experience discrimination or police brutality on the news or social media, directly experiencing discrimination, police brutality, profiling, observing white people receive less punishment, less intervention by law enforcement. Let's just reflect briefly to what happened last week, right? We saw a large group of white people pretty easily overtake the United States Capitol, right? With minimal law enforcement intervention. We've seen similar things happen throughout history, but in 2020, there are a lot of examples of that. But what did we see in contrast to that when DC had their Black Lives Matter march, right? We saw exponentially higher police and military presence. So what does that say, right? Housing discrimination still happens. Predatory lending practices. One thing that's not on here, but that I just want to point out, think about those payday loan places that we see on literally every corner in poor communities. And who are those designed to target, right? Positioned where they are. If you know anything about those payday loan places, their interest rates are like 900%. It's something crazy, right? So there's those types of practices that still exist. Chronic health conditions, school curricula ignoring or minimizing historical contributions of people of color, right? Not seeing representation that looks like you. Medical abuse, hearing another person of color be called a racial slur, directly being called a racial slur, being descended from a person who was enslaved, being descended from a slave owner as a person of color, that's traumatic because there's a lot that had to happen there in order for that to be the case. History glorifying your ancestors' abuser. Think about how we talk about manifest destiny and the trip west by white settlers, right? I grew up in Kansas, so my history and the depiction I got of the Trail of Tears and those concepts like manifest destiny, super inaccurate, very much glorifying the white experience, making it sound heroic, and absolutely minimizing the violence and abuse that happened along the way. Lack of access and education, lack of quality of education, because if you know anything about how education is funded, you know it's funded through property taxes. And so if education is funded through property taxes and we have a disproportionate amount of poverty in communities of color, are their schools going to get funded well? No, they're not. Right? So there's an immediate disparity there. Mass incarceration, and again, just the understanding that our systems were designed with the view and belief that you are not a full human. Think about our Constitution, right? Black people were 3/5 of a person, right? That had to be amended. Humanity had to be amended. You think about it in those terms, it's crazy. The system is designed to keep you from thriving. And that's just the truth of it. So how does all this impact mental health? Well, it's interesting because Black Americans, Black people, Hispanic, Latinx people have an overall lower risk of lifetime prevalence of mental disorders than white people, but they have a higher risk of persistence and a higher risk of disability resulting from mental illness. So what that says is that there's less access to care, less continuity of care, right? And there's barriers to unpack there, right? There's transportation, there's poverty, there's work, there's all of those things that impact a person's continuity of care from their end, right? As the individual, as the client. But think about that, higher persistence and resulting disability from mental illness. And, you know, like I said, racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately represented in vulnerable populations, right? Homelessness, incarcerated, whose responses aren't typically recorded in community surveys of mental health. So while it looks like they have overall less likelihood, that may itself not even be correct because of these disproportionate numbers in underrepresented populations, right? Undersurveyed populations. And for American Indian tribes, First Nations people, Indigenous people, the lifetime prevalence of a psychiatric disorder is much higher than the overall population. So think about that in context of what has historically happened to disenfranchised Indigenous folks in the United States. And there's a lot there. There is even something that we haven't talked about, which is nutrition, right? When Indigenous people were forced onto reservations, government provided food. And same as, you know, initially with the welfare system, right? Government provided food, super unhealthy, caused diabetes epidemic, especially on Indian reservations. So there's things to unpack there. And of course, as we know, if you have a chronic health condition, it impacts your mental health. All of that is connected. So one of the ways generational trauma takes shape is mental health issues, right? There's historically less access, historically less quality care, historical abuse in receiving care, frequent intersections of multiple systemic and interpersonal barriers over time, okay? So remember our products of racism, right? Cycling back up with that narrative. These things get observed by providers, and then there becomes the assumption that somehow this is a choice, right? It's an issue of motivation. All of these things come into play. So all this exposure to constant stress, is it stressful to be impacted by racism? Think about when you've had a combination of stressful events back to back to back, right? Me, this year, I've moved, I had a miscarriage, I got divorced, I moved again, my dog had a back injury resulting in paralysis for a month. I got to watch my entire family get COVID and not be able to do anything about it. My grandma passed away. Most of those things happened in the last 4 months, right? That's a lot of stuff going on in a person's life. So take all of these things throughout history that have compounded in communities of color, and then those daily reminders that you don't belong, that you are different, that you are not the norm, that you are a threat, all of these kind of microaggressions, things that happen. There's never a break. There's never been relief. So what does this do? This constant exposure to stress. Let's look quickly at a normal stress response. It goes up, comes back down. There may be a little plateau at the top where you hang out for a little bit, but the stressor goes away, you return to your baseline of functioning. Well, let's look at chronic stress. Very different. We have our baseline, we have a stressful event, but then when you have a stressful event immediately after, you don't return to your baseline. You have a new baseline. So then the next stressful event comes. You don't return to your baseline. You have a new baseline, and it just continues to increase. And all of this stress compounds over time, creating conditions that would really prevent anyone from thriving, truthfully. Thinking about the year of 2020, how hard was it for you to thrive during that period of stress and overwhelm and not knowing what was coming next, trying to adjust to ever-changing circumstances? Think about that and understanding how that relationship between history, historical aspects of racism, how those impacts have carried through to the present, what that does to a person and to a community. So barriers to care, these are things for you to think about as a provider. Bias in research, use of the white male as the normative standard, right? Oops, sorry about that. Use of the white male as the normative standard. Bias in instruments and measures of functioning. Historically labeling the individual as dysfunctional, but what impact does generational trauma have? When we look at diagnostic tools, we look at, IQ tests, we look at all of these things. Now, granted, they've improved and they now often accommodate, they often include those socioeconomic factors, right? The social factors that contribute to mental distress, mental illness, but that hasn't always been the case. And so while our instruments have improved, keep in mind the power of those narratives, right? That narrative, those informing things are still present. And we need to actively be working against those things. Mistrust, personal and community experience, right? Why, there's now coming out Black communities being very apprehensive about the COVID vaccine, right? Think about why that is, though. As I touched very briefly on, medical experimentation and exploitation, there's such a long history there. It makes sense that there would be a collective apprehension to something like that. To seeking care, mental health care in general, there is a level of mistrust. And as I mentioned before, with social work, there's a lot to unpack there, a lot of beliefs about, regarding family separation, taking kids away, not understanding cultural differences among families, all of those things. Lack of insurance is a barrier. Lack of diversity in the mental health profession, still a white-dominated profession. And what does that do? Do people feel comfortable seeking care? Lack of diversity in practice methodology, incorporating traditional healing methods, right? That's something that's starting to happen now, but it's interesting. A quick aside, like I said, it's hard not to go on tangents, but if we think about historically traditional healing methods from indigenous cultures, from African nations, from Central America, from right here in what we call the United States now, there were traditional healing methods that are now resurfacing because white people have said it's okay. I just want you to think about that and how that must feel. Even if we look at things like EMDR, for those who are familiar with that, like we're talking about tapping, we're talking about movement, we're talking about sensation, tactile, there's lots of things that have come out within the last decade or two about drumming. There's drumming, therapeutic drumming groups, music. Where did all those things originate from? They didn't come from white people. But through the course of colonialism and imperialism, those things that were beneficial to cultures, to well-being, mental and physical well-being, were stamped out and thought to be savage and were essentially disallowed. And now suddenly they're making this comeback. So I just kind of want you all to reflect on that too, understanding where some of these practices came from and making sure that in our quest to become more culturally competent and have better healing methods that are more inclusive, we also need to be mindful of the roots of those things too, because it matters. And a lack of research regarding the use of traditional healing methods, right? Because, we are a science-driven profession now. And so there has to be that idea of evidence-based practice. So in order to incorporate these methods into our practice, there has to be research and there has to be established methods and qualifiers to happen, right, in order for us to use those things. And we need to be consulting with the people who are parts of the community, or who are part of the communities where those healing methods originated from. Complex barriers. If you are viewed by society as less valuable, less human, then your well-being is not a priority of those who have resources and training to help. If you are viewed as deserving of your condition, then providers are less inclined to provide care. If you are viewed as inherently more likely to be violent, engage in criminal activity, use substances, be ill, be unmotivated or lazy, then providers may feel less urgency to provide care. So these are the places where our bias and perception as providers come into play. And we need to be thinking about these things and unpacking them. We've all had a client that comes to us with a rap sheet, right? They've had services before, and there's all this list of things that they didn't do or they didn't say or whatever. And so that immediately we take that in. And we may say, oh, it doesn't impact me, but it does impact you. It's in your mind. The seed has been planted. And so when we know that's a reality. It's the same for all of these less conscious narratives that have been fed to us throughout our entire life. And so as we are seeking to provide care to communities, to individuals, we need to be keeping these things in mind and making sure that we're doing our due diligence to not let it impact our relationship and our interaction to the best of our ability, and to understand our limitations there and be honest with ourselves. All right, one last thing. Are you an ally? It's just a simple question, right? Are you an ally to people who don't share your racial identity, who are historically oppressed because of their skin color? Think about where you fall. Are you apathetic? Do you have no understanding? Are you aware? You know basic concepts, but you're not active. Are you active? You're well informed, sharing, seeking diversity when asked or prompted, or are you an advocate? Committed, routinely, and proactively championing inclusion. Right? Where do you fall? Think about your own bias and beliefs concerning your practice, your work. What information informs your work? Who are your sources? Who do you look to as leaders in the profession? Is that a diverse group of people? How does your bias impact your practice? Can you see the connection between history, narrative, bias, trauma, and mental health? And what role do you or will you play in finding a solution? And now I'm going to stop talking and stop sharing my screen. I feel like I've probably gone way over time, and I do apologize. Oh, I didn't.
Yeah, you're good. You did it.
I'm so proud of myself. Oh my God. So I do have here our social media handle, Diversity and Resiliency Institute of El Paso. You can follow us on social media. And I know that Megan linked our website and the resources as well. Just a couple of things. We do have a 6-hour asynchronous anti-racism training. We also have a 5-hour asynchronous LGBTQ plus training on our website. And then we just recently have been awarded a grant to provide deaf cultural competency training for mental health providers. And that registration for that training is now live. So that is also available on our website, and we'll be offering that monthly throughout the year. So that's just a couple of things we have going on. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would love to hear from anyone who has questions, comments, thoughts, maybe something you feel like I missed that would be important to include moving forward, or something you feel like I got wrong. I'm open to hearing any and all questions or feedback.
I have one if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yep. So first of all, excellent presentation. I think it was a solid presentation, great presentation. Agree with everything you said. I think I put in the chat, the only thing I would also highlight, I know that we often said we're empirical research now, but I think that as a field, we've always thought we were empirically researched, even in the 1700s with Samuel Wright and Benjamin Rush and all these, it was all backed by empirical or empirical research. So just making sure that we're still continuing to be critical as a psychologist and a professor at UT Austin. I've realized how, one, we're underrepresented in the research game as Black people, people of color, we're underrepresented in the research game. And two, when our manuscripts are submitted, they're often given revised and resubmit or rejected because our sample isn't generalizable enough, because we focused on Black people or Hispanic people or what have you. So a lot of the research that's being pushed has strong ends or populations of mainly white people. So just want to name that and put that out there. I think it falls in line with everything you've been saying. So realizing that even when we say now we're in research and empirical, well, we've always thought that we still have to be critical about what we're doing with the information that's given. That's it. Thank you, though. Great presentation, though.
Thank you. And thank you for that comment. Absolutely. 100%. Right. It's hard to get research out there when it's shot down. So yeah, I greatly appreciate that. And I think, as a person who is getting newly engaged in that research process, because we are looking to do some publications based on some of the trainings that we've had and the impact that has had specifically on white people. I think it's important to understand that, we have to continue to question, and that just because something is published, right, doesn't necessarily mean it's the be all end all. And we have to do our due diligence to make sure that our sourcing, our what we look at and what we value as important in the profession is diverse. And I think, a point of advocacy for anyone in the field is to advocate for our colleagues who are trying to do that work, and help put some steam, right? Filling that ally role, help to put some steam behind them and offering any assistance or resources, monetary or otherwise, to help make those things happen. So Ryan, I really appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you. I'm anxious to hear if anyone else has questions or comments.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
You're a little quiet, but I can hear you.
Okay. I agree with what you said earlier about not being, you may not have been a part of slavery, but you're still impacted daily by it. As a Black person, you are so right on with that. We do think about what's going on every day throughout the day. So I guess my question is, how do you respond to those other individuals who may say it's time to move on? That we're living in the past. But you're right, it's hard not to live in the past because you're seeing it continually. So what should a response be?
That's a great question, and that is such a hard thing to respond to, because it really truly comes from a place of just complete ignorance and complete inability to have empathy for that situation. I think for me, what I have found effective at times, not always, but at times, has been to basically ask a person to recall something painful in their life.
Okay.
Or recall something painful that happened to a relative, a parent. Maybe their parent was abused growing up. Maybe then they experienced abuse from that parent. And helping them to see, okay, your parents' abuse didn't happen to you, but it affects you.
Right.
Or maybe dad losing his job. Well, dad's job loss, that didn't happen directly to you, but you're going to feel the economic impact of that, right? You're going to feel the residual effects of that, even though it didn't happen to you directly. So it's almost a matter of just asking them to pull something that's more from their life, because for people who struggle to make those connections and to feel empathy for others, right, it can be beneficial to ask them to pull from something from their life. And again, like I said, it's been effective sometimes in conversations, not always. Some people are just in denial and they don't want to understand or realize that people have a different reality and experience than they have. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Anita, I see your hand is raised if you want to go
Hi,
ahead.
Sylvia.
Yeah. Hi. One thing that and Megan's going to know what I'm going to talk about. I am with UTA in Arlington, University of Texas, Arlington, with the public health program there. And this is definitely.
Oh, there we go. I think you're muted though.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. What I would really impress upon anyone that is going into that is critically looking at this, the issue of racism, is to bring in that public health aspect of it too. Because this is one thing that we've just learned with now. One thing that I if someone asks me what is public health, well, now they don't have to ask me because now they know, because man sneezes in China and we have a pandemic. But this is at a core value of public health, is that systemic racism and the idea that, well, we got rid of slavery, so therefore it all disappears. And that is the whole culture behind it, that no, it doesn't. And like you, I am a white woman. I am an older white woman, so I grew up in the 60s and I lived outside of DC, so I am very aware of the race riots and the culture. I think back at the culture that I would not say that our family was openly racist. I do have family members that were and are, but at the same time, having that conversation with them, they're already angry. Okay, they're already posturing and being angry because they know that there is a guilt associated with it. And I think that is the biggest thing. It's not, and I have this conversation with my husband, it's not about being guilty, it's about getting angry that we're still having to deal with this crap. And that, but definitely pulling in the public health aspect within anything that we're doing, that is, it's a huge thing. And it's also about educating creating an educated citizenry now. Okay, back in 2003, the Institute of Medicine issued their, call to action of, institutions to create educated citizens on all of the information, all the structure of racism, of social, the social determinants of health, all of these things. And here we are, 17 years later, and we're still trying to deal with that. But I think that's part of the part of what we need to do, is to include that in the narrative and include that public health aspect throughout. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was maybe back in July or so, Pepperdine University Psychology Department has a podcast, and they had me as a guest on there, and I talked about a blog article that I had written called "White Supremacy is a Public Health Emergency." And the whole premise behind that, exactly what you're saying, right? And I completely agree with you. White supremacy is a public health emergency. I'm sure that you all heard about the mass shooting that happened in El Paso, where a young white man drove from North Texas down to El Paso and shot up a Walmart, killing a bunch of people. In the name of white supremacy.
Right.
That's a public health emergency.
Absolutely.
Right? White shootings in the name of white supremacy, those are public health emergencies. The disproportionate deaths and chronic impact of COVID in communities of color is a public health emergency. Generational poverty is a public health emergency as a product of racism and white supremacy. All of these things, I wholeheartedly agree what you just said. And honestly, like, we can do a full day on that and that alone, because
absolutely,
it's so important, in trying to establish these links. You can never hit everything in such a short period of time. but it is also interconnected. That, you know, the interconnection between class, between gender and sex, between race. There's so much to unpack there. And yeah, it's incredibly complicated. And I think that that's why it's so easy for people to just say, ugh, fine,
That's it.
whatever, never mind,
Yep.
you know, because it just feels too much. It feels too overwhelming.
That's exactly it. And that is a conversation that I've had with Megan, as well as having it with others, is that, you know, I like the way you say unpacking, because that's exactly what it is. You have to unpack it. But at the same time, it's so overwhelming that people want to just say, I'm not responsible for that. That's not part of me. I didn't say anything to that man to make him go do that, you know, and then move on with their lives, because mentally they cannot manage to wrap their heads around it. So I think unpacking it piece by piece and partializing it, you know, is one way to go with it. But education, this type of education is really what's important, you know, for anybody in anywhere. I mean, it needs to be taught, and it's been ignored for way too many years. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great,
I would
great
like
presentation.
Yeah, I would like to say something.
Sure.
Awesome presentation. As I said in my comments, I really appreciate the honesty and transparency of your presentation. And I guess I just want to say that, yes, when we talk about these matters, it does become a very touchy issue for white people, but it's not meant to make you feel guilty. What it's meant to do, first of all, is to re-educate, because there's been so much miseducation in America of who has contributed to the building of this country, and people of color have been left out of the narrative for so long. So that's the first thing it's meant to do. Second of all, it's meant to have white people understand their white privilege, that it does exist, and it's not something that's made up, something that we imagine. It does exist. And while you may not have perpetuated slavery or perpetuated Jim Crow or any of those things, you have benefited from it. And that's what we're saying, is you have benefited from it, acknowledge that you have benefited from it, and then let's see what we can do to work together to try to make this as equal of a playing field for everyone, so that it truly can be a place where everyone can thrive and can become better versions of themselves, and society much better. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I really, really appreciate this this presentation that you've done. And I look forward to being actively involved as well. Thanks.
Yeah, and I, you know, bringing up privilege, like, oof, like we could just talk about that forever and ever. But, you know, as I talked about with that, you know, analogy of the house and the foundation, you know, there is such, think about it. If you perceive this as your house and someone else walks in, you know, or is perceived to be taking in your space, that is 100% a threat. And so when we're talking about this idea of racial equity and civil rights and all of these things for white people, even those of us who truly don't believe we are racist, truly don't believe we have a racist bone in our body, right? That idea of, well, what does equity really mean? You know, because I see how other people have been treated who don't look like me. I don't want that for myself, you know? And so there's this idea, this fear surrounding, what is that even going to look like? What is this society going to look like when there's true racial equity? No one knows, because it's never been done before. And so there's this fear surrounding the unknown, and this fear surrounding the idea that for white people, it means giving up something, you know, and truthfully, it does. It means giving up power, right? It means giving up power. And for most white people, it's power that they don't necessarily acknowledge or understand that they possess, But when it starts to feel threatened, you feel threat from somewhere for something, and you're just not quite sure what. So it's such a complicated, like, it's a psychologically complicated thing to unpack. And, you know, that's partly what I personally, as a professional, as a white professional in this field, am trying to focus on, is getting that switch start to flip for my fellow white people to start to unpack that very complex psychological mess that's happening up there concerning racial equity. So Rachel, I really appreciate your comments there. Thank you. Anyone else have any comments or questions?
I think, did Joe Arrington, did you have your hand raised? Did you have a question for us? I'm sorry, Joe. I don't think we can hear you.
Can you hear me now, Megan?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much, Megan. Ms. Ashley touched on it a little, went into that avenue during the conversation between her and when Miss Corbett, Anita Corbett, was talking. But I just wanted for that to see, just to see from Ashley, when the situation occurred that brought national attention and international attention to El Paso. Are you still receiving a lot of fallout, even though we don't see it necessarily on the news anymore? Are you still, through your agency, coming across a lot of fallout from mental health situations that might have been rooted or fertilized with that incident that took place at Walmart?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think, you know, unfortunately, as with literally everything, COVID really changed a lot as far as folks accessing support, et cetera. Of course, everything is remote, online, but it's different. So it's interesting, when that incident happened, we had, myself and our executive director, we were facilitating an anti-racism group, a live in-person group at the center. It was an 8-week group that met weekly, and the Walmart shooting happened in the midst of us facilitating that group. And so what ended up happening is we spent a couple of sessions really just processing that trauma, because people who were attending knew people who had been killed in that incident. And we talked a lot about you know, those narratives, white supremacy driving those things. And so we definitely had a lot of therapeutic things happening within that group. But on top of that, we had, like most places in El Paso, you know, there was free therapy, free counseling being offered for people. And then, of course, you know, that happened in September. And then, of course, you know, COVID, you know, shortly after, and it changed things. I think it's difficult maybe for some people to understand how that has impacted them at this time, especially because, you know, going out in public has been more limited. But I know for myself, even as a white person that was living in that community at that time, and for other people as well, going out into a public space in the days after that incident had happened was terrifying. You know, panic attacks, right? It was incredibly terrifying because you never knew. It completely changes, you know, how you look at your neighbors, how you look at your environment. And so, you know, that in itself, now my own personal experience and response to that situation is a teaching tool. Because if that one incident impacted me in that way, what does it feel to have all of these generational events, all of these, you know, everyday, quote, small occurrences of racism? How does that impact, you know, a person and how they interact with their environment? So I know I kind of went off on your initial question, but to answer your question, the impact is still there. I think it's just difficult to tell what that looks like now because COVID has changed so many things. But, you know, there's this belief that because El Paso is a predominantly Hispanic community, that there's no racist white people there. And I can tell you with great confidence that that is not true. And I can also tell you with great confidence that there is racism within the Hispanic community towards the small Black community that lives in El Paso as well. And there's colorism and there's all these difficult things, right? So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how things take shape following that tragedy over the next, you know, 3 to 5 years or so, especially as life hopefully starts to return to a place where people can move about more freely and kind of engage with their social lives again. So I really appreciate you asking about that, though. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, we're about towards the end. Ashley, did you have time or we gotta close out? I just wanted to make sure you're
I'm
good on
fine.
time. Okay.
Yeah, I have time if people still had more questions. Of course, no, if Megan, if it needs to close, that's fine. But I'm
Okay.
also
Well, if there's one more question, we'll go ahead and leave room for it. Otherwise, we'll be finished. And I want to thank everybody here for participating in today's meeting. There was such great conversation in the chat, really digesting what you had to say, Ashley. The presentation was phenomenal. And we thank you so much for your time and dedication to this topic and to your action work. I do want to remind everybody, I was posting a link to our post survey. Please participate in that survey so we can better suit your needs within the community, so we can provide better presentations like Ashley's and going into the new year. And if you are wanting CEUs are available. You do need to complete your survey and they are $10. So if you complete the survey, I'll see your information. If you haven't paid, I'll come get it. But other than that, thank you so much for your participation. Oh, go ahead.
I think Sylvia
Yes,
has a question.
yes. How are you doing? I wanted to tell you how I enjoyed your presentation, and I think it really helped. I'm still trying to understand what happened at the Capitol. And so I have to ask you, in light of all your experience and the presentation today, your thoughts on what happened in our country, and unfortunately that will be a historic day. So that's what I wanted to ask you, Ashley.
Well, thank you very much. My truthful and honest thought is language that I'm not going to use on this forum, but you know, terrifying, right? I think, you know, as I highlighted before, the stark difference in response, and this is not the first time that has been evident, but like, right, we saw even you know, even with Michigan, with all that's happened with their governor there, and the armed white men going into the state capitol and all those things, you know, right? I think if anything, it just demonstrates the deeply embedded foundational problem that we have in who we view as a threat, who law enforcement views as a threat. Because we all know it doesn't take much imagination to think what would have happened if that had been a group of Black people. You know, it doesn't take any imagination, because we have seen, even within the last few months after the murder of George Floyd, after response from the murder of Breonna Taylor, after Ahmaud Arbery, all of those things, any types of gatherings that took place, right, were heavily responded to by law enforcement. Even in Dallas, right, y'all saw that. And, you know, I don't know, Sylvia, to be quite honest, I think it's going to be very telling what happens over the next couple of weeks as we move to inauguration of a new president. I think that the failure of, you know, this current administration to respond in any meaningful way to any of the racially charged incidents that have happened, and the fact that many people, while there has definitely been national outrage, there's still a lot of people that really are just fine with the way things are. And so to be quite honest, my thoughts and opinion is that it's incredibly disturbing, and it's now more important than ever that anyone who does have an understanding of these concepts, right, that we've talked about, that y'all have heard in other places, or even just an inkling, a beginning of an understanding, that we all have to be doing the work of pulling more people in. There is no more excuse. There really wasn't ever an excuse, but I think now we've seen how deeply divided we truly are, that we never weren't divided on these issues. There's just been Band-Aid after Band-Aid put over, and no real deep-seated change to grab this issue by the root and rip it out and plant something new. That has never happened. And I think as folks who we are working in the community, we're working with people, we have an added obligation and responsibility to really be educating ourselves, especially if we're white, and speaking truth to power, and getting in there and really doing the work that's necessary. And it's not going to be comfortable or feel good ever. It's just not. But that's the reality of it. So I don't know if that really answered your question. Certainly a very disturbing and scary thing that happened. And I think for me, it's added motivation to push forward, and understanding that as we are all doing that, there's going to be times where we have to carry people. You know, there's a place for me to speak on this stuff. There's a place for me to sit down and shut up. And I think that it's very important that we all understand that, and understand that our roles collectively in the mental health and social service community is to support each other and uplift and really be a voice of advocacy for equity in general. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Ashley, for your thoughts and sharing all this great information with us. We're truly grateful for you and for your partnership. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, for our conversation. Claps all around.
Thank you.
Yes, I truly love these conversations, and I love the community coming together to really dive deep